The first sound was not political. It was wet. A short blade punching through wool, then meat, then a second blade, then a third. The men who killed Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BC, were not artists. They were a pack, hands slick, breath ragged. One of them missed and stabbed a fellow conspirator through the arm. They grunted as they worked. 23 wounds. They hacked at the man who had rebuilt their world until he folded at the base of a statue. Pompey's statue, his old rival, watching in marble. This was not an execution. It was a slaughter in good sandals. They thought the killing was the answer. It was only the door opening. Blood was on the wind now, and something worse than Caesar was already moving toward the smell. Their mistake was the size of the Republic itself. 60 senators believed that if you killed the man, you killed the idea. They thought Rome was a broken machine, and Caesar was the cracked gear. Pull him out, and the old Republic would hum back to life on its own. So they walked into the forum with red hands and shouted about liberty. Rome did not cheer. Rome stared. Hollow faces. Quiet mouths. Brutus stepped forward and spoke of tyranny and freedom, like a teacher in front of a starving classroom. He did not understand who he was talking to. The crowd did not care about ancestral virtue. They cared about Caesar's grain in their children's bowls, the land deeds in their husbands' hands, the hard, simple peace he had clamped down on a city that had bled through 100 years of civil war. The senators offered them a principle. Caesar had offered them dinner. Across the Adriatic, in the garrison town of Apollonia, a ship docked with the news. A courier carried it to a thin, sickly teenager who coughed too much and slept too little. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew. A boy that no serious man in Rome bothered to fear. His tutors and advisors went pale. They begged him to vanish, refuse the inheritance, burn the will, drop the name. To accept anything from Caesar now, they told him, was to walk into Rome wearing a target stitched in purple. The boy listened. He did not weep. He did not tremble. He heard a vacancy. The largest predator in the Roman world had just been pulled down. The throne was warm and empty. Every legion, every province, every fortune in the Mediterranean was suddenly in play. For the assassins, the Ides of March was the end of the story. For Octavius, it was the bell ringing for supper. Before we go further, tell us in the comments which city and country you are watching from. We read every one. If you want more unfiltered history like this, hit subscribe. It is the single best way to keep these stories alive. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. 60 men stood in a circle, breathing hard. Their daggers dripped onto white marble. No cheers, no prayers, just the wet sound of lungs working and the copper stench rising off the floor. The room was not the Senate House proper. The old Curia Hostilia had burned down 8 years earlier in the riots after the murder of Publius Clodius Pulcher, and the new one Caesar was building on the same spot was not finished. So the Senate had been meeting in the Curia of Pompey, a marble hall annexed to Pompey's great theater complex on the Campus Martius. The irony was sharper than any blade in the room. Caesar had spent 4 years hunting Pompey across Greece, Egypt, and Africa. Now he had died inside Pompey's building at the foot of Pompey's statue on the morning of March 15th, 44 BC. Suetonius tells us the statue was draped with his blood. Plutarch tells us Caesar's last act, before the wounds dropped him, was to pull the upper fold of his toga over his head and let his legs fall together at the knees, so he would die with some dignity. He was 55 years old. He had survived Gallic ambushes and Egyptian palace coups, and the cavalry of Pharsalus. He died on a stone floor with men he had pardoned standing over him. There were 23 wounds. Only one, a stab to the chest, was judged fatal by the physician Antistius, who later examined the body. The rest were panic, men hacking around each other in a tight ring. One conspirator, in the confusion, drove his blade into the hand of Marcus Junius Brutus instead of Caesar. Gaius Cassius Longinus pulled himself together first. He had been a quaestor under Crassus at Carrhae, one of the few Roman officers who escaped the disaster that killed an entire army in 53 BC. He had stared at the Parthian sky filled with arrows and lived. A dictator on the floor of a Roman hall did not shake him. Beside him, Brutus looked at his own hands. Brutus was 41. His mother Servilia had been Caesar's lover for 30 years. Some in Rome whispered that Brutus was Caesar's son, though the dates did not quite work. He had fought for Pompey at Pharsalus, been pardoned by Caesar after the battle, taken governorships, taken honors. He had read every page of Cato the Younger's last writings before they were copied to a wider audience. He had married Cato's daughter, Portia. He had struck his benefactor in the groin. The others shifted and glanced at the door. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, the man Caesar had trusted enough to name as a secondary heir in his will. Servius Sulpicius Galba, a former praetor, passed over for the consulship. Lucius Tillius Cimber, who had begun the attack by grabbing Caesar's toga as a fake petition for his exiled brother. Publius Servilius Casca, who had struck the first blow just under the throat while standing behind the chair. His brother Gaius Casca had struck the second. There were 60 in the room. Cicero was not among them. The conspirators had not trusted his nerve or his mouth. The plan had two halves. Half one, kill the dictator. Half two, the Republic snaps back into shape on its own, like a sprung trap returning to rest. Half one was finished. Half two had already begun to fail in the silence after the last wound. They did not even take the body. According to Suetonius, 3 of Caesar's household slaves arrived later and lifted him onto a litter. One arm slipped loose and dragged along the side of the box. They carried him across the Campus Martius and into the city, past frozen onlookers, all the way to the official residence on the Sacra Via, where Calpurnia was waiting. She had begged him that morning not to go. She had dreamed of a collapsing gable on their house. He had laughed it off over breakfast and walked out the door anyway. Brutus and Cassius led the others out of the Curia and across the porticos of Pompey's theater. They had to step over the body of a senator named Publius Servilius, who had fainted in the chaos and been trampled. They emerged into the open. The day was bright. The wind was up. They held their blades aloft, smeared red to the hilt, and started across the city toward the Forum. A boy on Brutus's staff was carrying a freedom cap on the point of a spear, the soft conical pileus given to manumitted slaves as a symbol of liberty. It was meant to be a banner. It hung limp. The Forum was packed because the rumor had reached it before the conspirators did. The first man to run out of the Curia screaming had been the senator Marcus Junius Silanus. His shouts had traveled faster than any messenger. By the time Brutus climbed the rostra, thousands had gathered, and not one of them was cheering. Cassius Dio describes the silence. He says it was the silence of men waiting to see who would die next. The rostra itself was a stone platform on the north side of the Forum, decorated with the bronze prows of warships captured from Antium 3 centuries earlier. The heads of Roman politicians had been displayed on it within living memory. Sulla had nailed his enemies there. Brutus knew the stone. He had stood on it before. His voice came out thinner than he expected. He He spoke about ancestral liberty. He invoked Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had thrown out the last king of Rome in 509 BC, his claimed ancestor. He spoke about Cato. He spoke about law and the dignity of the citizen. The crowd watched him the way a butcher's dog watches a man it does not trust. These were people who remembered Marius marching on the city in 87 BC. They remembered Sulla's proscription lists nailed to the forum walls in 82, names added in fresh ink every morning, heads brought in for cash bounties. They remembered the food riots under Clodius. They remembered the year 52 BC, when the Senate House itself had been used as the funeral pyre for Clodius's corpse, and the building had burned down with him inside. Caesar had stopped that. Caesar had given the urban poor free grain through the dole he reformed in 46. He had settled 80,000 veterans on plots of land across Italy and the provinces. He had staged games where 400 lions died in a single afternoon. He had drained the Pomptine marshes and rewritten the calendar so that the year matched the sun. And these men in expensive togas had just killed him for it. Brutus held up clean ideas. The forum saw red hands. A senator named Publius Cornelius Dolabella climbed up beside him and tried to help. Dolabella was 25, ambitious, and had been promised the consulship by Caesar for later that year. He pivoted instantly and declared himself a liberator too. The crowd did not warm to him either. The conspirators backed off the platform. Their bodyguard, a unit of gladiators that Decimus Brutus had kept stationed nearby in the portico of Pompey's theater, closed around them. They moved up the steep path toward the Capitoline Hill. They barred the temple doors of Jupiter Optimus Maximus behind them and posted gladiators at every gate. They had killed Caesar at the 5th hour of the morning. By sundown, they were already hiding inside a temple. Down in the city, the real hunters were already moving. Mark Antony was 38. He had been Caesar's questor in Gaul, his master of cavalry, his co-consul for the year 44. He had run the Lupercalia festival a month earlier, on February 15th, where he had 3 times offered Caesar a diadem in front of the public, and 3 times Caesar had refused it. Whether that performance had been staged to gauge the city's mood or to make Caesar's refusal look good, no one ever agreed. The conspirators had argued about killing Antony too. Cassius had wanted it. Brutus had vetoed it. Brutus said they were liberators, not assassins, and that adding Antony's body to Caesar's would make them look like a faction, not a cause. So Antony walked out of the Curia of Pompey alive. Trebonius, one of the conspirators, had pulled him aside in conversation at the door and held him there in small talk while the others went in to do the work. Antony bolted home, threw off his senator's toga, and put on the rough tunic of a slave. He barricaded the doors. He expected a knock that never came. By the evening of the 15th, he understood. Nobody was coming. He could breathe. He could plan. He could move. He walked across the city the next morning to the Domus Publica, the official residence of the Pontifex Maximus, where Caesar had lived and where Calpurnia had spent the night with the body. He sat with her. He spoke softly. He left with 2 things worth more than 10 legions: Caesar's private papers and Caesar's will. The papers included unfinished decrees, pending appointments, drafts of laws. Antony would spend the next months claiming Caesar had planned all sorts of things, producing documents nobody could verify. Cicero would later complain that half the legislation passed in the spring of 44 was forged out of those captured files. Meanwhile, another piece slid onto the board. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus was Caesar's master of the horse, the dictator's official deputy. He commanded a full legion stationed just outside the city, troops being prepared for the eastern campaign Caesar had planned against Parthia. On the night of the 15th, Lepidus marched those soldiers onto the Campus Martius and made camp in plain sight of the Capitoline Hill. He did not have to make a speech. The sound of caligulae on Roman dirt was the speech. Antony held the politics. Lepidus held the swords. The conspirators on the hill held a view of the river. The Senate convened on March the 17th in the Temple of Tellus, near Antony's house on the Esquiline. They did not dare meet in the Curia of Pompey. The bloodstains had not yet been scrubbed off the marble. Cicero spoke. He was 62 years old, the last of the great Republican voices, and he had not been told about the plot in advance. He was furious that Antony was still alive, but he stood and argued for a Greek solution, an amnesty modeled on the one declared in Athens after the fall of the 30 tyrants in 403 BC. Forget what had been done. Forgive everyone. Move on. Antony agreed on one condition. All of Caesar's acts and appointments had to stand. Every law, every governorship, every benefit promised to a veteran. The conspirators, on their hill, accepted. They thought they had bought peace. What they had actually done was hand Antony control of the entire machinery Caesar had built. Amnesty for the killers. Validation of everything the dead man had done. A polite contradiction, written in ink, agreed to by men who knew it would not hold. It held for 3 days. Antony had insisted on a public funeral in the Forum. The conspirators should have refused. Cassius wanted to refuse. Brutus, again, overruled him. He said denying Caesar a state funeral would look like vengeance against a corpse. He agreed to the funeral. He agreed to let Antony deliver the eulogy. He agreed to let the will be read aloud in public first. 3 agreements. 3 nooses. The pyre was built in the Forum near the Regia, the ancient residence of the kings of Rome, which Caesar had used as the office of the Pontifex Maximus. Across the square stood the Temple of Venus Genitrix, which Caesar had dedicated in 46 BC, claiming the goddess as the ancestress of the Julii through Aeneas. Every brick of the setting was an argument about who Caesar had been. A herald climbed onto a platform and read out the will of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, Calpurnia's father, who had retrieved it from the house of the Vestals where Caesar had deposited it. 300 sesterces to every citizen of Rome. More than 3 months of a laborer's wages. The gardens beyond the Tiber opened to the public. And as a secondary heir, in case the primary should not survive, the name of Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, one of the men who had stabbed him. The crowd heard that name read out, and a sound went through them like a wind through dry grass. Then Antony stepped forward. He did not shout. He did not call for blood. He had a herald read out, one by one, the honors the Senate itself had voted Caesar in his lifetime. The title, Father of the Fatherland, the chair of gold, the right to wear the triumphal toga at any public event, the oath every senator had sworn to defend Caesar's body as their own. Antony let the words hang in the open air. Many of the men who had sworn that oath were locked behind the doors of Jupiter's temple a few streets away. Then he spoke about Caesar himself. Quietly, Appian preserves a version of the speech. Antony moved from grief to bewilderment to a slow, controlled fury. His voice broke at the right intervals. He looked like a man holding himself together by a thread. He had prepared something. Caesar's actual corpse was in poor condition. 3 days dead, sewn back together by Antistius the physician. Antony had ordered a wax effigy made, life-sized, naked, painted to match. Every one of the 23 wounds rendered in red wax, gaping, exact. The figure was mounted on a tropaeum, a rotating device used in theater for processions. As Antony spoke, slaves cranked the handle, and the wax Caesar turned slowly above the crowd, presenting each wound to every face in the forum. A long, low sound came out of the crowd. Not a wail, not a growl. Something in between. Then Antony reached down and took the real toga off the real body. Stiff with dried blood. Punctured. Slashed. He held it up by the shoulders. He pointed at the holes. This rip, Cassius made. This one, Casca. This one was Brutus. The crowd was no longer a crowd. Someone threw a magistrate's chair onto the pyre, then a bench, then the wooden barriers around the law courts. Soldiers stripped off their cloaks and threw them in. Women pulled off bracelets and amber pins and threw those in too. Musicians hurled their flutes. Two men, identified by Suetonius only as figures armed with torches, appeared out of nowhere and lit the heap. Suetonius compares them to the Dioscuri. Other ancient writers thought they were Antony's agents. The fire went up. By the heat of it, the bronze doors of the Regia warped on their hinges. Two nearby buildings caught and burned through the night. Then the crowd picked up burning logs and went hunting. They went first to the house of Cassius, on the Palatine. They found it empty and torched it. They went next to the house of Brutus. The doors held. They piled wood against them and set them alight. Antony's own people, perhaps wisely, eventually stepped in and dispersed the worst of it before half of Rome burned. They caught a tribune named Gaius Helvius Cinna in the street. He was a poet, a friend of Catullus, a man who had loved Caesar and written verses for him. He had the misfortune of sharing a name with one of the conspirators, Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who had given a speech in the Forum the day before mocking the dead dictator. Helvius Cinna shouted his real name. He shouted his profession. He shouted that he had loved Caesar. They tore him apart. Plutarch says his head was put on a spear and carried through the city. Cicero would later refer to the scene with a kind of nausea, as if it had marked the exact moment the rule of law in Rome had ended. The liberators of Rome were now refugees. Brutus and Cassius slipped out of the city by night, under armed escort. Cassius rode east toward Syria, where he had served before, where he had legions who remembered him. Brutus went south first, then crossed to Greece. Decimus Brutus went north to take up the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, which Caesar himself had assigned him. Their republic, the one they had drawn in their heads on the Ides, was burning in the Forum behind them. Rome belonged to Mark Antony. Stories like this one, the real anatomy of how power changes hands, do not get told properly anymore. They get sanded down in textbooks or stretched into 10-hour lectures with no pulse. At Ancestral, we excavate them and rebuild them at the highest level we can manage. Every frame, every line, no compromises. That work is carried by a small group of viewers who decided to stand closer to the project. The lineage. Members get early access, deeper cuts, and a direct hand in keeping this channel alive and independent of the algorithm. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, click the Join button and take your seat in the lineage. Now, while the Forum still smoked and the mob still roamed the streets looking for senators to dismember, a ship was crossing the Adriatic in the other direction. East, toward the coast of Illyricum, toward a garrison town called Apollonia, on the eastern shore of what is now Albania, near the modern village of Pojan. Apollonia was a Greek colony founded in the 6th century BC, perched on hills above the river Auyos. Caesar had stationed 6 legions and a large cavalry force in the region in preparation for the Parthian campaign he had been due to launch in 3 days. The streets were full of soldiers waiting for their general to arrive. The general would never come. A courier carried the news up from the harbor. It was delivered to an 18-year-old, pale, thin, often sick, asthmatic, according to Suetonius. He had been studying rhetoric with the philosopher Apollodorus of Pergamon and the Greek tutor Athenodorus Canaanites. His name on his birth certificate was Gaius Octavius. His family came from the small town of Velitrae in the Alban Hills. His grandfather had been a money changer. He was nobody. His name in Caesar's freshly opened will was something else entirely. Caesar had adopted him by testament. He had made the boy his son. He had made the boy his heir to 3/4 of his entire estate, an inheritance that included properties across Italy, the political clients of one of the largest families in Rome, and the loyalty, however notional, of every Caesarian veteran in the empire. The men around him panicked. His stepfather, Lucius Marcius Philippus, sent letters by fast courier begging him to refuse. His mother Attia sent letters of her own, terrified. The senior officers in Apollonia gave him the same advice in person. Salvidienus Rufus and Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, 2 friends of his own age who were studying with him, were the only voices on the other side. The older men told him to burn the will, stay out of Italy, take a different name, live a long, quiet life in some Greek city by the sea. Refuse, refuse, refuse. They were not being cowards. They were being correct. Antony would crush him. The assassins would hunt him. The Senate would fear him. The legions would laugh at him. He had no money in his hands yet, no political experience, and a body that struggled with cold weather and long marches. They saw a teenager about to walk into a butcher's yard wearing a target. The legions in Apollonia, however, told him something else. When word of Caesar's death reached the camps, several officers came to him directly and offered him the army. "Take command," they said. "March on Italy at the head of 6 legions and avenge your father." He refused that too. He sat with the letters in his lap and the candle burning low, and he did the math in a way none of the older men had thought to do. Caesar was dead. The seat was empty. Antony was strong, but not yet sovereign, and the alliance with Lepidus was new. The assassins were on the run, scattering toward the provinces, none of them with an army yet ready. The Senate was paralyzed. The veterans across Italy, 80,000 of them on their farms, were leaderless and grieving, and looking for someone with the right name to follow them. The right name was now his. To take 6 legions and march on Italy as a rival warlord was to be Sulla. To arrive alone with only the name was to be something Rome had never seen before. He chose the second. He told the men in the room that he was going to Italy. He told them he was accepting the inheritance. He told them he was taking the name. From the moment he stepped off the ship, he would sign documents and address troops and answer to one word: Caesar. He crossed at the next opportunity, landing not at the main port of Brundisium, where he might be ambushed, but at a small harbor up the coast called Lupii. He sent scouts ahead. He confirmed that Brundisium was safe. He moved. He did not sail as a mourner. He did not sail as a boy. He sailed into a country where the previous Caesar's blood was still wet, on the floor of a Senate chamber that nobody dared use, where Antony was already measuring himself for the throne, where the killers were raising armies on 3 different coasts, and where every veteran in every farm in Italy was waiting for a signal he was about to give them. Somewhere on that crossing, between Apollonia and Lupii, the world tilted on its axis. Antony did not feel it yet. Brutus did not feel it yet. Cicero, drafting letters in his villa at Puteoli, did not feel it yet. But on the deck of a small ship, Watching the Italian coast resolve out of the haze, an 18-year-old with bad lungs and a borrowed name was already deciding which of them he would kill first. The boy stepped off the ship at Brundisium in the second week of May, 44 BC. He was 18, not yet 19. He was thin. He limped slightly from the long crossing. His hair was the color of dirty straw. His eyes were gray, set close, and quiet. He had not slept properly in a week. He had a small purse of his own money, 3 friends his own age, and a name that was not yet legally his own. Brundisium was the eastern gate of Italy. Long stone moles ran out into the harbor. The smell was pitch, fish guts, and the urine of soldiers. 6 legions assigned to Caesar's Parthian campaign were quartered in the area, idle, leaderless, waiting for orders that would never arrive. They had heard the news from Rome a month before the boy landed. They had not yet decided what to do about it. Within hours of the boy's arrival, they had walked down to the harbor to see him. They came in 2s and 3s, then in dozens. Veteran centurions with the bracelet scars of Pharsalus on their forearms, standard-bearers who had crossed the Rubicon in January of 49, old men with farms outside Capua who had ridden in from Apulia when they heard the rumor. They looked at him, and they did not see a boy. They saw the face of the man they had cremated in March. Suetonius records that the resemblance to Caesar in profile, especially around the brow and the line of the nose, was striking enough to make grown soldiers sit down on the dock and weep. They knelt on the wet planks. They kissed his hand. They called him by the name he had not yet publicly claimed, Caesar. He did not lecture them about the Constitution. He spoke to them in the language they understood. The bequests in the will. 300 sesterces for every citizen. The bonuses owed to the legions. Vengeance for the man who had paid them, fed them, and given them their land. He took their oaths without taking a title. 2 men stood at his shoulder during these conversations. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a peasant's son from the region of Apollonia, with shoulders like a wrestler and a flat, attentive face. He had crossed from Apollonia with the boy. He would never leave his side. The second was Quintus Salvidianus Rufus, a former muleteer who had once seen a flame play around his hair while he tended his herd and decided that meant something. He commanded the boy's escort. He would die within 4 years on a charge of treason. They moved north up the Via Appia in slow stages. Fundi, Formiae, Sinuessa. At each town, the column behind them thickened. In Cumae and Puteoli, on the Bay of Naples, the boy stopped to greet a 62-year-old man in a villa pressed against the cliff. Cicero was finishing a treatise. He had come south to escape Antony's Rome. The boy paid his respects with the politeness of a student. Cicero wrote to his friend Atticus the next morning. He said the boy seemed pious, intelligent, devoted to him personally. But he could not tell whether the affection was honest or a mask. He concluded the letter with the famous Greek phrase, "He is not one of ours." He meant it as a doubt. He did not yet mean it as a verdict. Then the boy went on. By the time he reached Campania, the column behind him was an army that had assembled itself out of farms and tavern doors. He had not given a single order to recruit. He had only arrived. In Rome, Mark Antony was watching with a half-smile. Antony had spent April and early May making himself the sole authority in the city. He had moved into Caesar's house on the Sacra Via. He had bought up Pompey's old confiscated estates on the cheap. He had seized the contents of the Temple of Ops on the Capitoline, the 700 million sesterces Caesar had stored there as the war chest for Parthia. He had a bodyguard of 6,000 Caesarian veterans quartered around the city, technically an unauthorized force, in practice an occupation. He held Caesar's private papers and was producing new legislation from them at the rate of one decree every few days. Cicero, watching from Puteoli, wrote to Atticus that Antony's forgery factory was producing more legislation in a month than Caesar had passed in a year. Two of those forgeries restored Deiotarus to the throne of Galatia in exchange for 10 million sesterces paid to Antony's wife, Fulvia, in cash. Fulvia. She matters here, and she does not get named enough. She had been married first to Publius Clodius Pulcher, the demagogue whose murder had triggered the riots of 52 BC. She had then been married to Gaius Scribonius Curio, killed in Africa in 49. She was now Antony's wife, his political organ, and, by Plutarch's account, the first woman in Roman history to appear on a minted coin. She held audiences in her own house. She drafted lists of clients. She wore a sword on her belt during the chaos that was coming. The boy arrived in Rome in late May. He went first to the house of his stepfather, Lucius Marcius Philippus, on the Palatine. He went next to the house of his mother Attia, who begged him on her knees to refuse the inheritance. He went, alone, to the Forum. He stood before the urban praetor, Gaius Antonius, Mark Antony's younger brother, and declared his acceptance of the testamentary adoption. From that hour, his legal name was Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He dropped the last word from his own self-presentation. He signed himself, then and forever after, simply Caesar. The next day, he went to see Antony. The meeting took place in the gardens behind Pompey's old portico, which Antony had appropriated. The doorkeeper made the boy wait in the antechamber for an hour. When Antony finally received him, he did so reclining on a couch with food on the table and a cup in his hand, surrounded by his staff. Appian and Cassius Dio both preserved the substance of the exchange. The boy asked formally for his inheritance. Antony refused. He claimed the money in the Temple of Ops was state property. He claimed Caesar's personal estate was tangled in accounting. He claimed the boy was too young to administer such sums and ought to be grateful for what he had, which was a name. He used that line in front of his officers. The boy who owes everything to a name. It was the worst sentence Antony spoke in his entire life. The boy bowed. He left. Within 10 days, he was selling property. He sold the estates he had inherited from his biological father in Velitrae. He pressured his mother into selling her holdings in the Alban Hills. He sold off the household plate. He went to Gaius Maecenas of Arretium, an Etruscan equestrian his own age, descendant of the old Etruscan kings, and borrowed against everything he could pledge. He borrowed from the priesthoods. He borrowed from the moneylenders along the Vicus Tuscus. He took on debt at rates that should have ruined him. Then he paid Caesar's will out of his own bones. He set up tables in the Forum between the Rostra and the Temple of Saturn, and disbursed the 300 sesterces per citizen by hand. The line stretched the length of the Via Sacra. He paid the cash bequests to the veterans in person. He opened the gardens beyond the Tiber to the public, as Caesar had directed. He staged the Ludi Victoria Caesaris from July 20th to July 30th, the games for Caesar's victories, paying for the lion shipments and the gladiator contracts out of his own borrowed money. During those games, on the 5th day, a comet appeared in the northern sky around the 11th hour. It was visible in daylight. It burned for 7 nights running. Pliny the Elder, who collected the accounts a century later, said it was the brightest object recorded in the sky in Roman memory. The boy stood up in the front row of the seats and announced to the crowd that this was Caesar's soul ascending. He had stamped it onto coinage within 90 days. The reverse legend read, Divus Julius, the divine Julius. He was now, in printed bronze, the son of a god. In the public mind, the equation reversed within 60 days. Antony had Caesar's gold and would not give it. The boy had no gold, but had paid Caesar's debts from his own bones. Antony was the heir who hoarded. The boy was the son who honored. The veterans began to drift out of Antony's bodyguard and into the boy's service. 2 whole legions, the Marcia and the Fourth, defected from Antony's army in November of 44 and marched south to join Octavian at Casilinum. They had been promised 400 sesterces per man by Antony. The boy offered 500. The bidding war had begun. The Senate watched with the quiet calculation of men who had survived Sulla, the Catilinarian conspiracy, and Caesar himself. At its head stood Marcus Tullius Cicero. He was 62. He had buried his daughter Tullia in February of 45 and never recovered. He kept a small shrine to her in his villa at Astura. He had hated Antony since the Lupercalia. He believed the Republic could still be saved if the right speech was given to the right room at the right hour. Between September of 44 and April of 43, he delivered 14 public attacks on Antony in the Senate. He named them the Philippics, after the speeches of Demosthenes against Philip of Macedon 2.5 centuries earlier. In them he called Antony a drunk, a forger, a gladiator, a brothel keeper, a parricide of the state. He accused Antony of vomiting up undigested food on the speaker's platform during a public assembly the year before, after a wedding banquet, in front of the entire Senate. The detail is preserved because Cicero made it preserved. He read these speeches aloud in the Curia, and then circulated written copies to every province from Spain to Asia. And about the boy he wrote, in a private letter to Brutus, dated July of 43, the line that would damn him. The young man, he said, must be praised, raised up, and put aside. Laudandum, ornandum, tolendum. The last verb meant both to elevate and to remove. It was a pun. Cicero was proud of it. He repeated it at dinner. The boy heard about the joke within the month. He did not forget it. He did not mention it. He continued to address Cicero in correspondence as father. Through the autumn and winter of 44 BC, the alliance against Antony came together. Cicero argued in the Senate that the boy's privately raised army, technically a private militia, and a criminal offense under Republican law, should be legalized retroactively. He argued that the boy himself, a private citizen with no magistracy and no military rank, should be granted propraetorian imperium. He argued that the boy should serve under the 2 new consuls of 43, Aulus Hirtius and Gaius Vibius Pansa, both of them former Caesarian officers whom Cicero now trusted more than Antony. The Senate agreed on January 7, AD 43. They voted Octavian into the Senate itself with the rank of consular. He was 19. He sat among men in their 50s and 60s in the temporary meeting place at the Temple of Concord and listened to the speeches in silence. The war was fought at Mutina, the modern Modena, on the plain between the Secchia and Panaro rivers. Antony had marched into Cisalpine Gaul to claim the province and had cornered Decimus Brutus, the conspirator governor, inside the town walls. The siege lasted through the winter. By March, Decimus's troops inside Mutina were eating their cavalry horses, then their pack mules, then leather strips boiled in vinegar. The Senate sent Hirtius, Pansa, and the boy north along the Via Aemilia to relieve them. It was the strangest campaign in Roman history. Caesar's adopted son marched at the head of veterans who had served his father in a coalition designed to rescue one of his father's assassins. The fighting was vicious. There were 2 battles. The first, at Forum Gallorum, took place on April 14th in marshy ground beside the Via Aemilia. Pansa was wounded by a javelin in the side. He was carried to Bononia. He died there 10 days later. The second battle, at Mutina itself, took place on April 21st. The legions of the Republic broke into Antony's siege camp. Hirtius led the assault personally and was cut down inside Antony's Praetorian tent. Antony retreated west across the Alps with the remnants of his army by way of the coast road, through Vada Sabatia, in a march that Plutarch describes as Antony at his best, eating wild roots beside his soldiers, drinking stagnant water from the same skin. Both consuls were dead inside a fortnight. The ancient sources record what was being said openly in Rome at the time. Suetonius preserves the rumor that the boy's own physician, a freedman named Glyco, had been arrested on suspicion of poisoning Pansa's wound, and that the boy may have arranged the death of Hirtius in the confusion of the storming. Tacitus alludes to the same story 2 generations later. The rumors were never proven. They did not need to be. Within a single fortnight, both serving consuls of the Roman Republic were dead, and a 19-year-old controlled 8 legions of seasoned infantry. The Senate, drunk on relief, voted a triumph to Decimus Brutus. They voted the boy an ovation, a lesser honor, a pat on the head. They voted Cicero the title of Pater Patriae for his leadership. They began to plan, in committee, how to retire Octavian from public life. Cicero, in private correspondence intercepted later, used the word tollendum again. Someone close to the boy showed him the letter. The Senate then sent him written orders to hand his legions over to Decimus Brutus and return to private life. He read the orders aloud to his officers in the camp at Bononia. The reaction in the camp was a snarl. Hand a legion of Caesarians over to the man who had led Caesar by the toga into the Curia of Pompey. The men refused. Their general did not have to persuade them. He simply did not order them to obey. He turned the column south. He marched on Rome. He sent a deputation of 400 centurions ahead of him into the Senate house itself to demand the consulship for their commander. The senators objected that he was underage by 16 years. The senior centurion, a man named Cornelius from the Martia Legion, slapped his hand on the hilt of his sword and said, in a phrase preserved by Suetonius, "This will give it to him, if you will not." The Senate did not give it to him in that meeting. He arrived at the Quirinal Hill with his 8 legions in the second week of August. The Senate gave it to him then. The election was held on August 19th, AD 43. He stood for the consulship. There was no opposition candidate. He chose his cousin, Quintus Pedius, son of Caesar's niece, as his colleague. He was 20 days short of his 20th birthday. He took the auspices at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline. 12 vultures circled the precinct as he sacrificed, the same number that had circled Romulus 700 years before at the founding of the city. The omen was reported widely. He made sure it was reported widely. His first act as consul was to push through the Lex Pedia. The law, drafted by his cousin and colleague, retroactively declared the murder of Caesar a crime of state and condemned every one of the assassins in absentia to death. The amnesty Cicero had argued for in the Temple of Tellus on March 17, AD 44, was annulled in a single afternoon by a vote of the same Senate that had passed it. The serpent had swallowed its keepers. Antony, meanwhile, had not been finished by Mutina. He had crossed the Alps with his army intact by the coastal route through Liguria. In Transalpine Gaul, he met Lepidus, who commanded 7 legions at the confluence of the Argens and Rhone. Lepidus's troops fraternized with Antony's across the camp ditches. They had served together under Caesar. They shared old centurions, old grudges, old debts. Within 5 days, Lepidus's army had effectively merged with Antony's. Lepidus wrote a letter to the Senate in late May, claiming the merger had happened against his will. The Senate did not believe him. By midsummer of 43, Antony commanded 17 legions in the west. He was not a fugitive. He was a king without a crown. Plancus, governor of Gallia Comata, joined him with another 4 legions in September. Pollio, governor of Hispania Ulterior, joined him with 2 more in October. Octavian and Antony were now the 2 largest armed forces in the Roman world, and the largest force of all, 21 legions under Brutus and Cassius, was assembling in Macedonia, Syria, and the cities of Asia Minor. In late October of 43 BC, the 3 Western warlords agreed to meet. The location chosen was an islet in the small Lavinius River, which the locals called the Reno, near the colony of Bononia in Cisalpine Gaul. It was the modern Lavino, a slow river running through reed beds. The islet was a flat slip of gravel and grass, perhaps 30 paces across. It was neutral ground because no force could be hidden on it. The river was waded across at the shallows. Their respective armies were posted on opposite banks at a distance of 300 paces. Pickets watched each crossing. The 3 principals were searched for weapons before they crossed. Each crossed accompanied by a single attendant who waited at the water's edge. They sat on folding stools under an open sky for 2 days. October light, cold wind off the Apennines, no advisors, no secretaries, a wax tablet and a stylus between them. Antony was the soldier, 40 years old, thick-necked, hard-drinking, capable of charm and capable of murder, the man who had read Caesar's eulogy in the Forum and burned the Republic with it. Lepidus was the priest, Pontifex Maximus, immensely wealthy through his marriage to the daughter of Servilia, politically cautious, useful primarily because of the 7 legions he had brought and the legitimacy of his name. Octavian was the boy who had been consul for 10 weeks and had killed 2 consuls without being in the room when they died. They drew the empire on the wax tablet. Lepidus took the 2 Spanish provinces and Narbonese Gaul. Antony took the rest of Gaul, from the Alps to the Rhine. Octavian took Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Italy was held in common, with Rome itself under joint authority. The eastern provinces and the war against Brutus and Cassius were reserved as a separate problem, to be solved with combined armies once they marched south. They styled themselves Triumviri Rei Publicae Constituendi Consulari Potestate, 3 men for the reconstitution of the state, with consular power. The Lex Titia, brought before the assembly in Rome on November 27, AD 43, by the tribune Publius Titius, was passed inside 1 hour. It granted them dictatorial power for 5 years, superior to every magistrate, exempt from veto, with the right to issue laws by edict. The Second Triumvirate was not a government, it was a syndicate. The first thing they needed was money. 45 legions, more than 200,000 men under arms, had to be paid an enlistment bonus of 5,000 sesterces per man at the conclusion of the Eastern Campaign. That was over 1 billion sesterces in promises, against an empty treasury and a credit market already wrecked by civil war. The second thing they needed was the elimination, in one stroke, of every senator and every wealthy equestrian in Italy who might oppose them when their 5-year term expired. They solved both problems with the same sheet of papyrus. They began to write a list. The book that holds the spine of this history, the long catalogue of names and last days that made the proscriptions of 43 BC the most precise act of state murder the ancient world ever organized, is one of the most uncompromising works of dark scholarship ever assembled. It was the primary source used to construct this script. Right now, you can find it by clicking the View Products button on your screen. We have placed it on the Ancestral Shop shelf, alongside a curated set of relics and pieces tied to the fall of the Roman Republic. Open the shop, walk the shelf while the story keeps running, and bring the document into your own library. The list was drawn up over the 2 days on the island. They traded names like merchants trading hides. Each man brought his enemies to the table. Each man was made to surrender at least one figure he loved or had once protected, as proof that the bargain was binding. Antony brought Cicero first. Octavian was Cicero's protégé. Cicero had defended him in the Senate. Cicero had advocated for his commands. Cicero had also written the line about elevating him and then disposing of him. Appian records that Octavian held out against Antony's demand for 2 full days. He argued. He delayed. He suggested alternatives. On the 3rd day, he agreed. Lepidus surrendered his own brother, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the former consul of 50 BC. He did not look up from the tablet as he wrote the name. Antony surrendered his uncle, Lucius Julius Caesar, the brother of his own mother, Julia. Octavian surrendered Cicero. He also surrendered Cicero's brother Quintus, who had served as his uncle's legate in Gaul. He surrendered Quintus's son. He surrendered several men who had voted for him as consul 4 months earlier. The first list contained 17 names. It was published on the columns of the Forum within days. A second list followed, then a third. By the time the triumvirs had finished, somewhere between 130 and 300 senators were marked, and roughly 2,000 equestrians beside them. The exact figure varies by source. Livy gave 130 senators. Appian gave 300. The intention does not vary. For each head delivered, the bounty was 25,000 denarii to a free man, 10,000 denarii to a slave, plus freedom and citizenship. The estates of the proscribed were confiscated to the state and resold at auction. The proceeds, in theory, would pay the legions. They sealed the document. They crossed back over the river to their armies in the failing afternoon light. They began the march south toward Rome along the Via Flaminia. Couriers were dispatched ahead of the column to the city, riding at the gallop, carrying the lists in sealed leather tubes. In a small villa at Tusculum, 15 miles southeast of Rome, an old man was finishing a book on moral duties. He had written it for his son, who was studying philosophy in Athens. He worked at a small writing desk by an open window looking out over the Alban hills. He could hear his slaves preparing dinner in the kitchen below. He did not yet know his name was on a piece of papyrus being carried down the Via Flaminia by a courier riding at speed. He would know within 9 days. By then, his villa would be empty, the books on his desk gathering dust, and a litter would be carrying him through the woods toward the sea, with a small party of loyal slaves walking beside him in silence. None of them yet brave enough to tell him that the road behind them was already full of horsemen. The triumvirs entered Rome at the end of November, AD 43, behind walls of legionaries marching in close order down the Via Flaminia. No speeches, no sacrifices at the temple of Jupiter, no address to the people from the rostra. They came with one document. It was nailed to a wooden board on the south wall of the Forum, beside the rostra, on the morning of November 28th. The light was thin and cold. The board was the size of a man's torso. Black ink on bleached papyrus, fixed with iron studs at the 4 corners. 17 names on the first list. The reading of it took less than a minute. There was no trial, no appeal, no defense. The text was administrative in tone, drafted by a clerk named Apollodorus on instruction. Any free man who delivered the head of a name on the list would receive 25,000 denarii from the public treasury upon presentation at the aerarium beneath the temple of Saturn. Any slave who delivered the head of his proscribed master would receive 10,000 denarii. his manumission certificate, and the citizenship of Rome stamped on a bronze tablet. Sheltering a proscribed man placed the sheltering household on the next list. Failure to report a known proscript carried the same penalty. The names of the killers would not be inscribed in the public records. There would be no shame. There would only be payment. For a long moment, the forum was silent. The wind moved an edge of the papyrus. A dog barked somewhere on the argoletum. Then the men gathered around the board began to move, slowly, then quickly, then at a run. Doors slammed across the city. Bolts dropped into iron sockets along the Vicus Tuscus and the Clivus Suburanus. Slaves were locked in interior rooms. Wealthy women emptied jewelry boxes into linen sacks and buried them under floor tiles. Within an hour, the first hunting parties were in the streets. Rome had become a butcher's yard. This was not the chaos of Caesar's funeral. This was bookkeeping. Every head had a price. Every house had a value. The lists grew through December and into January, and continued to grow through 42 BC. A second list, a third, a fourth, a seventh. By the end of the proscriptions, somewhere between 130 and 300 senators had been marked. 2,000 equestrians joined them on the boards. The total fortune confiscated by Appian's estimate came to roughly 200 million sesterces, less than the triumvirs had hoped, because so many of the dead had hidden their wealth in trust accounts the auctioneers could not trace. To close the gap, the triumvirs introduced the lex de mulieribus, a special wealth tax on the 1,400 richest women in Rome. Fulvia administered the assessments personally from a tablinum on the Palatine, with 2 of Antony's centurions standing behind her chair. That tax produced its own resistance. A woman named Hortensia, daughter of the orator Quintus Hortensius, who had been Cicero's rival in his prime, walked into the forum in early 42 BC at the head of a delegation of matrons in mourning dress and delivered a speech against the levy. Appian preserves the substance of it. She said that women had not killed Caesar, had not raised armies, had not sought consulships, and ought not to be made to finance the murders of their own kin. The triumvirs reduced the assessment from 1,400 women to 400. They added a property tax on all citizens worth more than 100,000 sesterces to make up the difference. Hortensia's speech was the last act of free public oratory in Rome for 40 years. The hunters were a new profession, discharged legionaries with no farm waiting, gladiators released from their lanistae for the season, common thieves who could read a name on the boards and recognize a face. They walked the alleys of the Subura and the Aventine with linen sacks at their belts. The sacks were for the heads. The heads had to be presented intact to the magistrate at the treasury for the bounty to be paid. A bag dripping dark red down the steps of the aerarium beneath Saturn's columns was the standard sight in the forum that winter. The treasury clerks kept a basin of water and a sponge at the foot of the stairs to wash the faces clean enough to be identified. The social bonds dissolved inside 10 days. A senator named Quintus Salvius was hosting friends at dinner on the Caelian Hill on the third night of the proscriptions when a messenger arrived with the news that his name had appeared on the latest board. His guests pushed their couches back and ran for the door, not finishing their wine, not collecting their cloaks. The soldiers came through the same door an hour later and cut him down beside his own table. His hand was still around the cup. The senator Statius the Samnite, 80 years old, opened his treasury, scattered his gold across the courtyard for his slaves to take, and set his own house on fire before walking back into the flames with his wife. The senator Vetulinus barricaded himself in his villa near Rhegium and held off 3 different death squads with a private guard of 15 retainers and a hired band of Brutian shepherds before being killed at sea trying to reach Sextus Pompey in Sicily. The praetor Thuranius was killed in his own atrium by his own son, who had inherited his debts and could not wait to inherit his estate. The boy received the bounty and was killed in turn within the year by a slave who recognized the family curse and acted on it. Some survived through ingenuity. The senator Antius Restio had once branded and chained a slave for theft. The same slave found him hiding in a pit beside an aqueduct outside Rome, fed him, dressed an old beggar in Restio's cloak, killed the beggar in his master's place, and showed the body to the hunters. They paid. Restio escaped to Sicily. The senator Hosidius Geta staged his own funeral on the Esquiline. His son lit the pyre while Hosidius watched from a shuttered upper window. The mourners wept on cue. The body on the pyre was a slave who had died of fever the night before, dressed in Hosidius's purple-bordered toga. Hosidius lived out the rest of the proscriptions in his own attic, fed by his wife through a hatch in the ceiling. The proscribed senator Pomponius escaped Rome dressed as a praetor in full official regalia, carried in an official litter by 6 slaves dressed as lictors with fake fasces of bundled sticks. He passed through 3 checkpoints by saluting the guards from the litter. He reached Sicily. The senator Varro, the great encyclopedist and friend of Caesar, was hidden in turn by 3 different farmers in Reate. He survived. His library of 400 years of Roman scholarship was burned by the hunters who came to his villa and could not find him. Most did not survive. Sons turned in their fathers. Brothers killed brothers. The historian Velleius Paterculus, writing 80 years later under Tiberius, said that the loyalty of slaves had been more reliable than the loyalty of sons, and that of wives more reliable than freed men. The case of Turia survives in an inscription her widower commissioned for her tomb, the so-called Laudatio Turiae, the longest private inscription in Latin. She hid her husband Quintus Lucretius Vespilio in a crawl space between 2 roof beams in their house for months, smuggling in food and wine, going out daily to the Forum to petition the triumvirs for his pardon. She got the pardon eventually. The marriage lasted 40 more years. At the top of every list was one name: Marcus Tullius Cicero. Antony had not forgotten the Philippics. He had not forgotten the accusation of vomiting on the speaker's platform after a wedding banquet in 47 BC, a charge Antony had never been able to scrub out of the record. He wanted Cicero hunted down personally, the head and the right hand brought to him in Rome, the hand that had drafted the speeches placed beside the mouth that had delivered them. The order was issued in writing to 4 separate centurions across 3 provinces in case one squad missed him. Cicero was at his villa in Tusculum, 15 miles southeast of Rome, when the first list went up on the morning of November 28th. His brother Quintus and his nephew Quintus the Younger were with him. They had been arguing about money for hours. They left together the same afternoon, traveling by litter south toward the coast. Quintus turned back the next morning to retrieve enough cash for the crossing. He was caught at his villa with his son. The hunters made the boy watch his father interrogated under torture for the hiding place of the family gold. Quintus revealed nothing. The hunters then tortured the son in front of the father. Plutarch says Quintus broke. He gave up the gold. They killed both men on the same floor. The boy was 18. Cicero went on toward the sea. He reached his villa at Astura, a small island off the coast of Latium connected to the shore by a wooden causeway, in early December. He boarded a ship and put out to sea, intending to cross to Macedonia and join Brutus and Cassius. The wind was northeasterly and strong. He was 63. He was seasick within 4 hours. He ordered the captain to put back into land. They came ashore at Caieta, modern Gaeta, a small harbor under a high cliff. He was carried in a litter up through the wooded ridge above the sea toward his villa at Formiae, 2 miles inland. Plutarch preserves what came next in his Life of Cicero, written about 150 years later from earlier Greek and Latin sources, including the lost memoir of Cicero's freedman secretary, Tiro. The death squad was led by a centurion named Herennius and a military tribune named Gaius Popilius Laenus. Years earlier, in 53 BC, Cicero had defended Popilius in court on a charge of parricide and won him an acquittal. Popilius had volunteered for this duty when the assignment was offered. Antony had paid him a personal bonus of 100,000 sesterces, drawn from his own purse and not from the treasury, on the day the squad rode out. A loyal Greek freedman, a barber-turned-grammarian named Philologus, who had been part of Cicero's household for 30 years and tutored his nephew in Greek, betrayed the route. He sent word from a roadside inn to Popilius's men in exchange for a promised share of the bounty. The squad caught the litter on the path through the woods, about a mile from the sea. December 7th, AD 43. Late morning. A thin sun through the pines. The slaves carrying the litter wanted to fight. They had clubs and a few short knives. Cicero forbade it. He had them set the litter down on the path. He had not shaved in a week. His tunic was stained with seawater from the crossing. His face was thin from weeks of poor food and no sleep. Plutarch says his hair was white with dust. He stretched his neck out over the edge of the litter, the way a condemned man on the scaffold offers his throat to the axe. He looked Herennius in the eye and said, in the words Seneca the elder later preserved in his Suasoriae, "Do it properly, soldier." Herennius needed 3 strokes to take the head off. The neck was thin, but the blade was poorly held, and the first cut went in at the wrong angle. Cicero's hands were then severed at the wrists. Both hands. Antony had specified both in the written order. The head and the hands were placed in a leather satchel and carried back to Rome by Popilius on a fast horse. He received the full bounty plus the bonus Antony had paid in advance. They were nailed above the rostra in the Forum on December 9th. Plutarch says the Roman people looked up and saw not the face of Cicero, but the face of Antony's soul. The platform from which Cicero had delivered the In Catilinam and the Pro Milone and the Philippics now displayed the mouth that had spoken them, slowly drying in the December air, beside the 2 hands that had written them. Cassius Dio adds the final scene. Fulvia came down to the Forum on the 2nd day of the display. She wore a black stola. She had the head taken down from the spike and laid in her lap on a cushion. She forced the swollen tongue out with her fingers, took a long bone hairpin from her own hair, and drove it through the tongue. She did it more than once. The crowd watching her did not speak. Philologus the freedman, who had betrayed his master, was eventually handed over to Cicero's stepdaughter Pomponia, the wife of his late brother Quintus, with the legal authority to dispose of him as she wished. She had him cut his own flesh into strips, cook the strips on a brazier, and eat them. The detail is in Plutarch. It is the only revenge the family was ever permitted by the new regime. By spring of 42 AS, 182 BC, the lists were closed. The proscribed who had survived had fled to Sicily under Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Great, who controlled the Western Sea with a fleet of 200 ships and had set up a parallel republic in Syracuse and Messina. Others had reached the African coast or the eastern provinces still held by Brutus and Cassius. The triumviral treasury was at last full enough to pay the legions their enlistment bonus. The Senate had been hollowed out and refilled with triumviral appointees, many of them centurions raised to senatorial rank overnight, men who could not read the speeches that had once been delivered in the building. Lepidus was left behind to govern Italy and run the city. the signal was unmistakable. He was the third partner in name only. He had not even been allowed to add a single name to the lists. Antony and Octavian crossed the Adriatic in the summer with 28 legions between them and an advance guard of cavalry. They landed at Dyrrhachium and at Apollonia, the same town Octavian had been studying in 18 months earlier. The dock where the boy had once been called Caesar by the first weeping centurions was now the disembarkation point for the army he commanded. He went up the same street he had walked as a student. The Greek tutor Athenodorus was still in the city. He sent a message asking the tutor to attend him. The tutor came. The boy gave him a chair of honor and asked him to continue for 1 hour the lesson on Stoic ethics they had been interrupted in the previous march. The tutor obeyed. The conversation is not preserved. They marched east along the Via Egnatia, through Apollonia and Thessalonica, and on into Macedonia. The road ran for 500 miles through pine forest and stone-paved mountain passes built by the Roman engineer Gnaeus Egnatius a century earlier. They were on the same road by which Caesar had marched against Pompey 10 years before. Brutus and Cassius had built an empire of their own in the east. They held Greece, Macedonia, Asia Minor, and Syria. They had stripped the temples of Pergamon, Ephesus, and Rhodes of their accumulated treasures. They had levied a war tax on the cities of Asia equal to 10 years of normal tribute paid in 2. They had sacked the city of Xanthus in Lycia, where the inhabitants had set fire to their own houses and thrown their children into the flames rather than surrender to Brutus's legions. Brutus had wept at the news and offered a reward to any soldier who could save a Xanthian alive. The reward was claimed for only 150 people, mostly slaves, who had escaped through a drainage culvert. They had raised 19 legions. They had 20,000 cavalry. They had a fleet of 130 warships that controlled the Aegean. They were the last army of the Republic, and they were waiting on the plains of Philippi in eastern Macedonia, 4 miles inland from the harbor of Neapolis, near the modern town of Crinides. Philippi was a coastal plain bordered to the north by mountains and to the south by a marsh that ran out to the sea. It had been a Macedonian gold mining colony founded by Philip II, father of Alexander, 3 centuries earlier. The Liberators had fortified 2 camps on rising ground astride the Via Egnatia, the road the triumvirs would have to use. Brutus held the northern camp against the foothills of Mount Pangium. Cassius held the southern camp against the marsh. A fortified wall, ditched and palisaded, connected the 2 camps across the road. Their supply line ran clean to the port of Neapolis, fed by the fleet of Marcus and Ahenobarbus from the Aegean. Antony and Octavian arrived in late September of 42 BC and made camp on the plain 3 miles to the west. Their supply line ran back through Amphipolis and Thessalonica and across the mountains all the way to Italy. It was thin. It was vulnerable. The autumn rains were due in 3 weeks. Their fleet had been defeated in the Adriatic by the Liberator admirals and could not bring supplies through. Cassius understood the geometry. He wanted to wait. Hold the position. Let the triumvirs starve in the autumn rains. Let dysentery do the work. He had been the quaestor who walked out of Carrhae alive in 53. He knew what hunger did to an army in the field. Brutus argued for battle. His own troops were eager. The legions were Italian Caesarian veterans who had been recruited east of the Adriatic, and they wanted the matter settled. His honor required a decision in the open. His philosophy required a clean ending. Cassius gave way. He should not have. The first battle was fought on October 3rd, AD 42, in the afternoon. The 2 armies met along the line of fortifications between the camps. Antony commanded his own wing personally against Cassius. Octavian, ill with the lung complaint that had followed him since boyhood, was carried out of his camp on a litter at dawn, after a dream in which his physician's brother, Marcus Artorius, warned him to leave the tent before sunrise. The dream saved his life. His camp was overrun within the first hour of fighting. Brutus's troops broke through his lines, captured his standards, plundered his tent, and looted his treasury. They stabbed an empty litter that had been left in the praetorium, believing the boy was inside. 3,000 of his men were killed in the collapse. On the other side of the field, Antony broke through Cassius's wall and stormed his camp. The dust on the plain rose so thick that neither commander could see the other half of the battle. Plutarch is explicit about this. Cassius retreated up a low hill with a small bodyguard. He could see his own camp burning below. He could not see Brutus's victory 2 miles away through the dust. He sent his friend Titinius with a cavalry escort to ride down and identify a body of horsemen approaching from the direction of Brutus's wing. Cassius watched from the hill. He had poor eyesight. He saw Titinius reach the horsemen. He saw them surround Titinius. He saw the riders dismount. He thought Titinius had been captured. The horsemen had in fact been Brutus's own men, dismounting to embrace a friend who was bringing them news of victory on the other wing. Cassius did not know that. He withdrew into the tent of his servant on the hill. He covered his head with his cloak. He called his shield-bearer Pindarus, a man he had freed after Cari, as a personal vow. He gave the order. Pindarus drove the sword in. The blade went through Cassius's neck at the same angle Herennius had used on Cicero 10 months earlier. Pindarus disappeared from history that hour. No body of his was ever recovered. Some sources say he was killed by Cassius's other slaves in grief. Others say he simply walked off the field and vanished into Macedonia. Titinius rode up the hill an hour later with the news of Brutus's victory. He found the body cooling. He drew the same sword from the same wound, said one line preserved in Plutarch about not being able to live after failing his friend, and killed himself on it. Brutus came at sunset. He stood over the corpse and said, "In the line Plutarch preserves, the last of the Romans." He meant it precisely. Cassius had been the last man in the army who had served under the Free Republic at its full strength. The bodies were not displayed. Brutus had Cassius cremated quietly on the island of Thasos to keep his death from the bulk of the troops. For 3 weeks, the two armies stared at each other across the corpses of the first battle. The dead lay where they had fallen. The weather turned cold. The crows came down off Pangaeum. Brutus's position was still strong. His supply line was still intact. His soldiers were still fed. The triumvirs were running out of grain and resorting to barley mixed with chaff. Antony rode through his own camp at night, with his cloak pulled over his armor, listening to what the troops were saying around the fires. The complaints were turning ugly. 2 cohorts of his Spanish auxiliaries deserted in a single night. Brutus's officers turned ugly, too. They had not crossed the Aegean to sit behind walls. Plutarch says Brutus's own troops shouted at him from the ramparts that they would fight without him if he refused to lead them out. His staff officers, Marcus Valerius Messala and Lucius Bibulus, begged him in the praetorium to hold the line. He overruled them. On October 23, AD 42, he led them out. The second battle was a collapse. Brutus's legions advanced too far too fast, lost their formations on the broken ground around the abandoned trenches of the first battle, and were caught in the flank by Antony's veterans who had been waiting precisely for that mistake. The line buckled at the 3rd hour. Then it folded. Then it shattered. By dusk, 14,000 of his men had surrendered. The rest were dead or running for the hills above the plain. Brutus himself escaped into the wooded ridges south of the plain with a few hundred officers and slaves. They sat through the night around a small fire in a ravine above a stream. He had not slept in 3 days. He recited a line from Euripides's Medea. He recited a line from Homer's Iliad about Patroclus. He turned to his friend Volumnius, the philosopher, and asked him to hold his sword for him so he could fall on it. Volumnius refused. Plutarch records the apparition. Twice in the weeks before Philippi, a tall, dark figure had entered Brutus's tent at night, while he sat reading by a single lamp. Brutus had asked it who it was. It had answered, "I am your evil spirit, Brutus. You will see me at Philippi." The second visit had come on the night before this final battle. Whether vision, fever, or guilt, the figure had kept its appointment. He turned to a Greek attendant named Strato of Epirus, a man he had known since their student days in Athens under the same philosopher. He held Strato's hand. He thanked him. He gripped the hilt of his sword, pointing upward, set the point against his own chest just below the breastbone, and fell forward onto it. He was 43. Antony found the body the next morning at the foot of an oak. He laid his own purple general's cloak over it. He had it cremated with full military honors and sent the ashes back to Rome to Servilia, Brutus's mother, the woman who had been Caesar's lover for 30 years and who had carried the original death warrant for her son in her own mouth. She received the urn in silence. She buried it on the family estate at Tusculum, in the same ground where Cicero had been finishing his book on duties the previous winter. Porcia, Brutus's wife and Cato's daughter, was already dead. The reports of how vary. The traditional account, preserved by Valerius Maximus and Plutarch, says she swallowed live coals when she heard her husband had marched east. Modern historians suspect she suffocated on charcoal fumes in a closed room, possibly by her own choice, possibly not. She left a single line to her husband by letter, that she would not be the daughter of Cato if she could not die when the cause did. Every conspirator was now dead. Decimus Brutus had been killed in Gaul, late in 43, betrayed by a Celtic chieftain named Camillus, who handed him over to Antony's men for a bag of gold and a promise of immunity. He was beheaded in a field near Aquileia. Trebonius had been tortured to death in Smyrna by Dolabella in January of 43. His head kicked through the streets by Dolabella's soldiers like a football until it was unrecognizable. The Casca brothers had both died at Philippi in the same hour, in the rout of the second battle. Tilius Cimber had drowned with his squadron in the Adriatic. Servius Galba had been killed by his own troops in a mutiny. Of the 60 men who had stood in the Curia of Pompey on the Ides of March, 44 BC, not one survived the autumn of 42 BC. The Republic was ash. The Senate was a clerical office. The law had been replaced by the bounty. The forum's stones had been washed of blood 3 times in 3 years. The Curia of Pompey itself had been walled up by decree on Antony's orders, and the spot where Caesar had fallen was officially declared accursed. On the plain at Philippi, in the smoke of the second battle, Antony and Octavian stood facing each other in the praetorium of the captured camp. Antony was 39. Octavian was 21. There were no enemies left in the world to share. There was only the world, and there were 2 of them. Antony took the east. Octavian took the west. The division was made by a single afternoon of conversation over a wax tablet, the same way the world had been divided at Bononia 18 months earlier. Only this time, the world was actually theirs. Antony rode south to winter in Athens, then on into Asia, where he would summon a queen named Cleopatra to a meeting at Tarsus the following summer. a meeting that would consume the next 11 years of his life and end on a marble floor in Alexandria. Octavian sailed back to Italy with the harder job. He had to settle 170,000 veterans on confiscated farmland across the peninsula. He would do it. The Italian countryside would burn for him before it stopped burning. The next war was already breathing. Thank you for staying with this story through to the last cut. If the work matters to you, leave a comment with the moment that struck you hardest. Hit the like and share this video with the one person in your life who will sit through history that does not flinch. Your support is the only reason this channel exists in this form. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. The story does not end here. The next chapter is already on your screen. The slow war between Antony and Octavian, the woman who stood between them, and the final breath of the Roman world, before it became something else. Click it now. Keep going. The descent continues.